The snow was falling. His hands were shaking. Blood had never done this to him. He couldn't speak. She wouldn't stop staring. He didn't listen when his instincts screamed to run. And when the little girl reached for his hand on that frozen Brooklyn bench, then a small voice shattered his isolation. "Mister, you're crying. You look lonely." "I'm fine, kid," Roy managed, his voice rough with disuse. "Come on," Isabella said, her small hand suddenly in his. "My mama's cafe is warm. She plays violin. It's charming. But here's where it gets really interesting." The cafe appeared between a laundromat and a pawnshop like something from a half-remembered dream. White Christmas lights framed the window. Inside, golden warmth spilled onto the snow-dusted sidewalk. A hand-painted sign read "Elena's" in delicate script. Isabella pushed the door open. A bell chimed. Cheerful, welcoming. The scent hit Roy immediately. Cinnamon, fresh bread, coffee strong enough to wake the dead. Heat wrapped around him after the bitter cold, and for a moment he couldn't move. Couldn't process that places like this still existed in his world. "Mama!" Isabella called, tugging him forward. "I brought someone." The woman behind the counter looked up from rolling dough, and Roy's breath caught. She was younger than him, early 30s, maybe, with dark hair pulled back in a bun that was coming undone. Flour dusted her apron, her forearms, and even a smudge on her cheek. But her eyes were kind in a way Roy had forgotten existed. The kind of eyes that belonged to someone who still believed people were worth saving. When those eyes landed on Roy, something flickered across her face. Recognition. No, that wasn't possible. They'd never met. But there was something, a pause, a sharp intake of breath, a moment where her hands stilled on the dough. Then she smiled. Careful, cautious, but real. "Coffee?" she asked simply. Roy nodded. He didn't trust his voice. Isabella dragged him to a corner booth, the kind with cracked vinyl that had been repaired with duct tape. The table wobbled. The whole place was worn, loved, lived in. So different from the polished restaurants where Roy had conducted business, where blood never showed on dark marble floors. Elena brought the coffee herself. Her hands, Roy noticed, were gentle. Healer's hands, not survivor's hands. No scars, no defensive tension. She set the cup down and started to turn away. "Mama, play something," Isabella insisted. "Play the Christmas song. The pretty one. Sweetheart, I don't think. Please." The little girl's eyes went wide. "For the sad man?" Elena's gaze met Roy's again. This time, he saw understanding there. She'd recognized his pain the moment he walked in. Not who he was, but what he was. Broken. "All right," she said softly. "One song." Elena crossed to the corner where a violin case rested against the wall. She lifted the instrument with the same gentle certainty she'd shown with the coffee cup, with her daughter. The bow touched strings, and the first notes of Silent Night filled the small cafe. But it wasn't Silent Night. Not the version everyone knew. Not the simple melody sung in churches and shopping malls. This was something else entirely, the same song, but transformed. The notes bent and twisted in ways that made Roy's chest ache, made his hands go numb around the coffee cup. This was his mother's version. The world narrowed to nothing but that sound. Roy was 7 years old again, sitting on a piano bench too big for his legs, watching his mother's fingers dance across ivory keys. She'd played it this way every Christmas Eve, her own arrangement, something she'd created just for him. "This is ours, Roy," she'd whispered. Our secret song. He was 17, slamming the door on her tears as she begged him not to follow his uncle into the family business. You're better than this. But he'd been young, stupid, hungry for the power he saw in men who took what they wanted. He was 35, standing outside her hospital room, too ashamed to enter. She'd been dying, and he'd sent flowers instead of showing his face. The nurse had told him later that Maria had died calling his name. The coffee cup trembled in Roy's hands. The melody wrapped around him like his mother's arms had never in those final years. Around him, the cafe disappeared. The lights, the warmth, Isabella's bright chatter. There was only the music and the crushing weight of 40 years of regret. The last note faded. Silence. Roy realized his face was wet again. His hands were shaking so badly that the coffee had spilled onto the table. Where did you learn that? His voice came out broken, raw. Elena lowered the violin slowly. Her expression had changed, softer now, understanding dawning in her eyes like she'd just solved a puzzle she hadn't known she was working on. I was a hospice nurse, she said quietly. Before I opened this place. Years ago, I cared for a woman named Maria Marchetti. She was special. Even at the end, she had this light about her. Roy couldn't breathe. She taught me that arrangement. Spent her last weeks making me practice it until I got it exactly right. Elena's voice caught. She told me her son was lost. That he'd walked away from everything good in his life and couldn't find his way back. She said. Elena paused, wiping her eyes with the back of her hand. She said if I ever met a broken man who recognized this song, I should tell him something. What? Roy whispered. What did she say? Elena crossed to the booth. She sat across from him, and when she spoke, her words were gentle as snowfall. She said, tell him his mother never stopped loving him. Tell him she forgives him. Tell him it's not too late to come home. The sob came from somewhere deep inside Roy, somewhere he'd locked away the day he chose violence over music. It tore through him, decades of guilt and grief and self-hatred breaking open like a wound that had never properly healed. She forgave you, Elena whispered. And Roy Marchetti, enforcer for the Marchetti crime family for 40 years, who had never shown weakness in front of another living soul, put his head in his hands and wept. Isabella's small hand found his shoulder. It's okay to be sad, she said wisely. Mama says sadness just means you loved someone. He had spent 40 years running from his mother's memory, building walls of violence and cruelty to keep her ghost away. But love, it turned out, was patient. Love could wait decades. Love could reach across death itself to find you when you finally stopped running. His mother had found him. After everything, after all his sins, Maria Marchetti had orchestrated this moment from beyond the grave. And sitting in a small cafe that smelled of cinnamon and hope, Roy finally understood. Redemption wasn't something you earned. It was something you accepted. He had spent 40 years running from his mother's memory. Now her love had found him anyway. But could a man with blood on his hands truly be forgiven? And what would it cost him to try? Roy returned the next morning. He told himself it was just to thank Elena properly, to apologize for breaking down in her cafe, to leave money for the spilled coffee. He told himself a lot of lies that first week. But the truth was simpler, more terrifying. He didn't want to go back to his empty apartment. Back to the silence and the ghosts and the slow countdown to a death that would surprise no one. Elena didn't ask questions. She just poured his coffee, black, 2 sugars, she'd remembered, and nodded toward his usual booth. The one in the corner where he could see both doors and all the windows. Old habits. By the third day, Isabella started bringing him her drawings. Crayon masterpieces of Christmas trees and snowmen. And once, a picture of a man sitting alone. "That's you," she'd said matter-of-factly. "Before you were sad." By the end of the first week, Roy had fixed the cafe's broken freezer door. Elena had protested, "You don't have to do that," but he'd done it anyway. His hands needed to build something instead of breaking things. 40 years of destruction. Maybe it was time to try the opposite. The second week, he repaired Isabella's teddy bear, the one with the arm hanging by a thread. The little girl had hugged him so tight he'd felt something crack in his chest. Not breaking. Opening. Morning coffee at 8 a.m. became routine. Roy would arrive, Elena would pour, and they'd sit in comfortable silence while Isabella colored or read or chattered about everything and nothing. Sometimes Elena would play violin, not his mother's song, but other pieces. Bach. Vivaldi. Songs that made the cafe feel like a cathedral. This is what normal feels like, Roy thought one morning, watching Elena laugh at something Isabella said. This is what I gave up. He'd traded this, warmth, laughter, belonging, for power, for respect built on fear, for a reputation that made men cross the street when they saw him coming. What a stupid, costly trade. By the fourth week, Isabella had started sitting with him, showing him her homework, asking him to help with math problems. Roy, who'd counted bodies and money for decades, found himself explaining subtraction to a 6-year-old. And finding joy in it. "Mr. Roy," she'd asked one day, "why don't you smile more?" "Haven't had much reason to," he'd admitted. "That's sad. Mama says everyone should smile at least once a day. It's good for your heart." For the first time in 40 years, Roy Marchetti was building something instead of breaking it. And he was terrified of how much he wanted it to last. It was the 5th week when Elena finally sat down with her own coffee and told him the truth about herself. "His name was Marcus," she said quietly, staring into her cup. "My husband. Construction worker. Iron worker, actually. He loved being up high, said the city looked beautiful from up there." Roy listened, knowing where this was going, knowing the tone of someone describing a ghost. Scaffolding collapse. 3 years ago this January. They said he didn't suffer, but how do they know? How does anyone know what those last seconds feel like? "I'm sorry," Roy said, and meant it. "Life insurance bought this place. I thought about going back to hospice nursing, but..." She gestured around the cafe. "I needed something alive. Something that grew instead of ending. Does that make sense?" "More than you know." Elena's eyes met his. "Isabella's my whole world now. Everything I do, every choice I make, it's for her. To give her something stable. Something safe." The words hung between them like a warning. Like a test. "I worked for bad people," Roy said slowly. "Did bad things. Things I can't take back, can't make right." He waited for her to stand up. To ask him to leave. To call the police. Instead, Elena reached across the table and touched his hand. The first real physical contact between them. Her fingers were warm, gentle, alive. "We all have pasts, Roy. What matters is what we do now." He stared at their hands, hers unmarked and soft, his scarred and weathered. Opposites in every way. Yet somehow, in that moment, they fit. "You're a good man," Elena said softly. "You don't know what I've done. I know what you're doing. I see you with Isabella. I see how you fix things, how you're trying to help. I see someone tired of being broken. Both survivors. Both are rebuilding from the ashes. Both lonely in ways that ran deeper than words could reach. Roy turned his hand over, palm up, and Elena laced her fingers through his. Neither of them spoke. They didn't need to. Some connections existed beyond language, beyond explanation. Two broken people recognizing each other's fractures and thinking, maybe together we could be whole. In the 6th week, Roy brought the music box. He'd carried it every day, tucked in his coat pocket like a talisman. But he hadn't opened it, hadn't tried to wind it. The silence felt safer than the failure of trying and hearing nothing. "Can you look at this?" he asked Elena one evening, after Isabella had gone upstairs to their apartment above the cafe. Elena took the box carefully, reverently. Her fingers traced the carved wood, the delicate inlay. "Roy, this is Maria's box. She showed me this. She kept it by her bed until..." She stopped, looked up at him. "This was yours. She gave it to me when I was 7. I broke it when I was 17. Smashed it against a wall during a fight. She fixed it, but it never played right after that. Stopped working completely about 10 years ago. And you kept it. It's all I have left of her." Elena opened the mechanism carefully. Roy watched her examine the spring, the cylinder, the tiny pins that plucked out the melody. Her brow furrowed in concentration. "It's fixable," she said finally. "The spring's broken, but we can replace it. The cylinder just needs cleaning. Some of the pins are bent but not broken." "We?" Roy asked. She smiled. "I'm not letting you do this alone. Maria was important to me too." They worked side by side for hours. Elena's kitchen table became a workshop. She had surprising skill with small mechanisms. "Hospice nursing taught you to be good with your hands," she explained. "Delicate work. Precise work." Isabella fell asleep on the couch, head resting against Roy's shoulder. He went very still, afraid to breathe, afraid to disturb her. This small person trusted him completely. Him. A man with blood permanently stained on his soul. "Some broken things can be fixed," Elena said softly, not looking at the music box but at Roy. "They're never exactly the same as before. But sometimes the repaired version is even more beautiful because you can see where it was broken and chose to heal." Roy's throat tightened. "Elena!" "Wind it," she urged. "Let's see if it works." With trembling fingers, Roy turned the key. Once, twice, 3 times. Then he released it. The first notes of his mother's melody filled the kitchen. Soft, slightly imperfect, but unmistakably hers. The same arrangement Elena played on the violin. The same song that had found him on that park bench 6 weeks ago. Maria's voice seemed to whisper through the music. "You found her, just like I planned. You found your way home." Elena's hand found his again. They sat in the quiet kitchen, Isabella sleeping peacefully, the music box playing its secret song, and Roy understood what his mother had done. She'd orchestrated this from beyond the grave. Every piece, Elena learning the song, opening the cafe, being exactly where Roy would stumble when he finally broke. His mother had created a path home for her lost son, marked in music and kindness and a little girl's innocent wisdom. Roy Marchetti, at 63 years old, with blood on his hands and ghosts in his heart, was falling in love. Not just with Elena, though God help him, he was. But with this fragile, impossible thing called family. Called belonging. Called home. He looked at Elena, at Isabella, at the repaired music box, and thought, I would die to protect this. He had no idea how soon he'd have to prove it. He was falling in love. At 63, with blood on his hands and ghosts in his heart, Roy Marchetti was falling in love. But his past was about to come calling. And men like Roy didn't get happy endings, they got reckonings. The past walked through the door on a Tuesday in February, dressed in an expensive suit and wearing a shark smile. Roy saw him before Elena did. He was refilling the sugar dispensers, back to the door, but he'd felt the shift in air pressure, the sudden cold that had nothing to do with the open door. Every survival instinct he'd honed over 40 years screamed, Predator. He turned slowly. Carlos Vallo stood in the doorway, snowflakes melting on his cashmere coat. 3 men flanked him, muscle, obvious and intentional. Carlos's eyes swept the cafe with professional assessment, cataloging exits, angles, and vulnerabilities. Then those cold eyes locked on Roy. There you are, Carlos said pleasantly. Been looking everywhere for you, brother. Isabella, who'd been coloring at the counter, went very still. Children knew monsters instinctively. She slid off her stool and ran to her mother, hiding behind Elena's legs. Elena's hand found her daughter's head protectively. Her eyes found Roy's, questioning, afraid. Roy straightened. He felt his old posture returning, the one that made men step back without conscious thought. Predator recognizing predator. Carlos. His voice came out flat, emotionless. The voice from his old life. I'm retired. Retired. Carlos laughed, crossing to the counter. His men stayed by the door, blocking it. Roy. Nobody retires from the family. You know this. We had a deal, you, me, Uncle Sal. Life contract. I walked away 3 months ago. You disappeared. That's different. Carlos's smile never reached his eyes. He glanced at Elena, at Isabella. Nice place you found here. Cozy. Family-friendly. The implied threat hung in the air like smoke. Roy moved between Carlos and the counter, between the threat and what he'd come to love. What do you want, Carlos? Uncle Sal wants you back. There's work. The kind only you can do. Carlos picked up a sugar dispenser, examined it like it was fascinating. The Colombo situation needs handling. Your special touch. Find someone else. There is no one else. Carlos set down the dispenser carefully. Too carefully. This isn't a request, Roy. It's a family obligation. I'm done with family obligations. The temperature in the cafe seemed to drop 10 degrees. Carlos's pleasant mask slipped, just for a moment. Roy saw the violence underneath, barely restrained. See, that's where you're wrong. Carlos leaned against the counter, casual as a knife to the throat. You don't get to be done. Not with what you know. Not with what's in your head. His gaze slid to Isabella again. Cute kid. What is she, 6? 7. Elena's sharp intake of breath. Roy's hands clenched. Carlos. Accidents happen, Roy. You know this better than anyone. Electrical fires. Gas leaks. Would buildings burn fast in winter? Carlos straightened his coat. Uncle Sal's being generous. 48 hours. Think about it. Think about what you're protecting here and whether it's worth the alternative. Get out. Thursday, 3 p.m. You know the warehouse. Don't make us come looking for you again. Carlos nodded to his men, then back to Roy. Oh, and Roy. That coffee smells great. Shame if something happened to this place. He walked out. His men followed. The bell chimed cheerfully behind them, obscene in its normalcy. The silence they left behind was suffocating. Elena waited until Isabella was upstairs before she exploded. Who was that? She gripped the counter's edge, knuckles white. What did he mean, family? What have you brought to my door, Roy? Roy couldn't look at her. I told you. I worked for bad people. Worked. He said family obligation. Life contract. Roy, what exactly did you do? The words came out hollow, rehearsed from years of internal confession. Marchetti crime family. 40 years. I was their enforcer. When someone didn't pay, I collected. When someone talked too much, I made them quiet. When Uncle Sal needed a problem to disappear. He finally met her eyes. I made problems disappear. Oh God! Elena's hand went to her mouth. I collected debts. Broke bones. Silenced witnesses. Each word tasted like ash. Things I can never take back. Can never make right. I walked away 3 months ago because I couldn't. I couldn't do it anymore. Thought if I just disappeared, they'd let me go. But they didn't. Men like Carlos don't let go. And Uncle Sal. Roy exhaled slowly. Uncle Sal doesn't accept resignations. Elena's eyes shone with tears, but her voice was steady. Cold. You need to leave. Tonight. Pack whatever you have and disappear. Go somewhere they can't find you. It was what he'd expected. What he deserved. But it still felt like a knife between his ribs. I know. I'll. Mr. Roy. They both turned. Isabella stood at the bottom of the stairs, her stuffed bear clutched to her chest. Her eyes were red. She'd been listening. Mr. Roy, are you leaving? The question broke him worse than any of Carlos's threats. He knelt down, bringing himself to her eye level. I have to, sweetheart. To keep you safe. To keep your mama safe. But you said, Isabella's voice cracked. You said you'd teach me chess. You promised to fix my dollhouse window. I know. I'm sorry. Mama says running away doesn't fix things. Tears streamed down Isabella's cheeks. She says you stay and you fight for what matters. Elena's breath hitched. Baby, this is different. Is it? Isabella looked at her mother with a wisdom far beyond 6 years. You told me Daddy died fighting for us. Fighting to give us a good life. You said that's what people do when they love each other. They fight. The words hung in the cafe like a bell's toll. Roy looked up at Elena. Saw the war happening behind her eyes. Fear for her daughter versus everything Isabella had just said. The truth versus the safe lie. Love versus survival. Elena's face crumpled. She covered her mouth, shoulders shaking. There might be another way, she whispered finally. There has to be another way. Roy stood slowly. Elena, you can't. My daughter just told me that you don't run from what matters. And she's right. Elena wiped her eyes fiercely. You're trying to protect us by leaving. But what if there's a way to protect us by staying? By ending this so they can't ever threaten us again. You're asking me to go to war with the Marchetti family. I'm asking you to fight for your life. For the chance at something good. She stopped, swallowed hard. For us. Roy looked at Elena, at Isabella, at the cafe that had become the first home he'd ever known. Carlos's words echoed. 48 hours. If I stay, Roy said quietly, things are going to get worse before they get better. Dangerous. There's only one way to end this, and it's going to put you both at risk. Then we take that risk together. Elena's hand found his. What do you need? What he needed was a miracle. What he needed was evidence that could bury Uncle Sal and the entire family. What he needed was protection for two innocent people while he burned down everything he'd spent 40 years building. What he needed was courage to believe he deserved a second chance. A phone, Roy said finally. And for you to trust me one more time. Isabella crossed the room and wrapped her arms around his legs. Don't go, Mr. Roy. Please don't go. Roy picked her up, held her tight, and made a promise he wasn't sure he could keep. I'm not going anywhere, sweetheart. Not anymore. But even as he said it, he could feel the clock ticking. 48 hours until Carlos came back. 48 hours to figure out how to protect a family that had somehow, impossibly, become his. But there was no other way. Not with men like Carlos. Not with the kind of past Roy carried. Or was there? He had 48 hours to turn evidence against the family that owned him. 48 hours to save the only innocent things he'd ever touched. And if he failed, everyone he loved would burn. The second the cafe door clicked shut behind Carlos, Roy moved. Not to pack. Not to hide. He crossed the dark apartment, pulled on his worn coat, and stepped back into the cold. Snow hadn't started yet, but the air felt loaded with it. He walked 6 blocks to a broken payphone beneath a flickering street lamp that buzzed like an insect about to die. He dropped in a coin and spoke Italian first. Old code, the kind that slid past listening ears. Then English, low and precise. I'm ready. The voice on the other end stiffened. Agent Marcus Chen had been waiting for this call for years, and never quite believed it would come. This is big, Roy. Bigger than you. Roy stared at his reflection in the cracked glass of the phone booth. Older than his years, eyes hollowed by choices he could never undo. I know. I'm not doing this for redemption, he said. I'm doing it for them. 20 years of evidence poured out of him in fragments and dates. Buried bodies, offshore accounts, names of men who laughed while people disappeared. The entire skeleton of the Marchetti family laid bare in whispered confession. One condition stood like a wall between them. Elena and Isabella, Roy said. They vanish from this world tonight. New names. New lives. Full protection. There was a long silence. Then Chen exhaled. We'll do it. But you'll have to wear a wire. We need Carlos on record. Roy's jaw tightened. Carlos Marchetti, blood, not just business. When? Chen hesitated. We heard rumors. Christmas Eve. Public appearance. A charity concert. Roy closed his eyes. So it was true. The setting was perfect. Applause to drown out gunfire. Music to mask screams. Carlos always loved theater. I'll get him to talk, Roy said. You get ready to move. The phone went dead. Snow finally began to fall, slow and quiet, as Roy stepped back into the dark carrying the weight of every name he'd just spoken. And none of the ones he couldn't. 2 weeks later, Elena stood in the cafe holding a clipboard, cheeks flushed with excitement. We're doing it again, she announced. The annual Christmas charity concert. For the Children's Hospital. For families who can't afford gifts this year. Borrowed chairs lined the walls. Neighbors volunteered lights. Someone donated a battered upright piano. The cafe became something bigger than coffee, It became a gathering place. Isabella twirled between tables with tinsel in her hair, singing Silent Night, off-key and proud. Each note landed like a small, fragile hope. Across the street, Roy watched from inside his car, hands gripping the steering wheel. He knew what Elena didn't. A public event. Emotion in the air. Carlos loved emotional settings. Loved breaking people where witnesses could feel it. Roy's chest tightened with the urge to warn her, to pull her far from danger. Instead, he stayed silent. Protection, he told himself, sometimes looks like ignorance. The phone rang at the cafe on Christmas Eve morning. Elena answered with flour on her hands. Café Belira. Carlos's voice slid through the line like a blade wrapped in silk. Tell Roy, tonight. During the concert. We'll be watching. The line went dead. 20 seconds later, Elena stood in front of Roy where he waited outside. You knew, she said, voice shaking. You knew they'd come. Roy didn't deny it. The FBI's coming. I'm handling it. Her anger broke through fear. You used us as bait? His voice cracked for the first time in years. I used myself. You and Isabella are the only innocent things I've ever protected. Silence stretched between them. Then Elena exhaled, long and trembling. Then we do this together, she said. Roy nodded, knowing partnership made the risk higher, and the loss unbearable. That night, as snow began to fall and Christmas lights flickered in windows, Roy Marchetti prepared for his final stand. But he had no idea how high the cost would be. The last chair scraped into place at exactly 7 p.m. Candlelight softened the cafe into something fragile and holy, wax tears trailing down glass, shadows trembling along brick walls. 50 people packed the room shoulder to shoulder. Children knelt on chairs. Parents whispered. Coats steamed gently near the door. Elena stood near the piano, fingers tight around her sheet music. Her smile held, but her breath came shallow. She kept glancing toward the door. Isabella bounded onto the small platform they'd built from stacked crates. My mama plays the most beautiful music in the world, she announced, loud and proud. Laughter rippled through the room. Elena sat. The first notes of Silent Night drifted out, not the familiar version, but her own arrangement, slower, aching. The room leaned into it. Across the street, in the shadows between parked cars, Roy watched through the glass. His coat hid the wire against his chest. His eyes moved constantly. Left, right, alley, rooftops, reflections in windows. 2 buildings down, an unmarked van idled. Agent Chen listened through headphones, fingers resting on the command radio. Waiting settled over the block like held breath. Where is he? Roy thought. At 8:47 p.m., Elena finished her second song, Ave Maria. The final note hovered in the air like a prayer that didn't want to land. Then the lights died. One clean snap. Darkness swallowed the room. A child screamed. A chair overturned. Someone shouted for the door. And then a voice cut through it all. Calm, amused. Nobody move. We're just here for Roy. From the street, glass exploded inward. Roy crashed through the cafe door, wood splintering under his shoulder. Here I am, Carlos. Emergency lights blinked red. 4 men fanned out inside. Carlos stepped forward, coat open, gun loose in his hand like he didn't need to rush. Uncle Sal sends his regards, Carlos said. Roy coughed a thin laugh. Tell him I'm done sending regards. Carlos smiled. Then you're done. Period. Elena moved before fear could stop her. She stepped in front of Isabella, arms wide, trembling but unbroken. "If you're going to kill someone," she said quietly, "you'll have to shoot me first." For a split second, even Carlos hesitated. Roy kept talking, slow, steady, drawing him out. "You really think this ends clean? After what you did to Benny, to Rosa, to the docks in '73. Carlos scoffed. They had it coming. The wire drank in every word. Sirens wailed faintly, too far to save anyone yet. Then someone inside Carlos's crew panicked. A gun jerked upward toward Elena. Roy saw it before anyone else did. He didn't think. He moved. The first shot punched into his shoulder. The second tore into his side as he twisted in front of her. Roy hit the floor hard. Blood spread fast across the snow-streaked tiles. Isabella's scream ripped through the room. "Mr. Roy! Mr. Roy!" Elena dropped beside him, hands slick with red as she cradled his head. "No, no, no, stay with me, please." Boots thundered. Windows shattered again. "FBI! Drop your weapons!" Chaos exploded. Shouts, scrambling men, a final desperate shot that never found a target. Roy's eyes fluttered. His lips moved. Elena leaned close. "Music box," he whispered. "Fix it for her." Then the world went dark. The cafe was unrecognizable, chairs overturned, candles guttered into black wax puddles, the smell of gunpowder clinging to coffee and pine garland. Paramedics pushed through the crowd. Elena refused to let go of Roy's hand until someone gently moved her aside. Isabella stood frozen near the wall, clutching the broken music box to her chest like it was a living thing. Outside, snow fell harder now. Carlos was slammed against a squad car, face twisted with fury as cuffs snapped shut. Agent Chen leaned close to Roy as they lifted him onto the stretcher. "You got him, Roy. You got them all." Sirens tore into the night. At the hospital, Elena paced barefoot on cold tile while doctors shouted numbers. Roy's vitals crashed once, then again. Each time, they dragged him back. 3 hours passed like a lifetime held underwater. Isabella sat on a plastic chair in the waiting room, silent, unwinding and rewinding the broken music box with shaking fingers. The question hung in the humming air. After a lifetime of dealing death, would Roy be allowed to live? For 40 years, Roy Marchetti had dealt in death. Now death had come for him. But love, it turned out, was a stronger force than anyone expected. Roy surfaced slowly, through sound first. A rhythmic beeping, air moving through plastic. The faint rattle of a cart in a distant hallway. Then pain. It bloomed through his side and shoulder in deep, echoing waves. His mouth was dry. His eyelids felt sewn shut. When he finally forced them open, the ceiling swam above him, blurring in and out of focus like water over glass. And then he saw her. Elena sat in a stiff plastic chair beside the bed, curled forward, still wearing her concert dress. Dried blood darkened the fabric near the hem. One shoe lay discarded beneath the chair. Her head rested against the mattress, fingers loosely wrapped around his hand. "She didn't go home," Roy whispered, voice raw with tubes and dust. Her eyes snapped open instantly. Relief flooded her face so hard it almost broke her. "You woke up," she breathed. He swallowed, struggling to breathe through the weight in his chest. "You should go home. You shouldn't see me like this." Elena huffed a quiet, trembling laugh. "I was a hospice nurse, remember? I've seen worse than stubborn old Mafia men who refuse to die." He closed his eyes for a second. Is Isabella? She won't leave, Elena said gently. She's in the cafeteria with Agent Chen. She made him promise to stay until you wake up. A long silence settled between them. Roy turned his face slightly toward her. I'm sorry, he whispered. I brought this on you. Elena shook her head. No, you brought yourself. A broken man trying to find his way home. The words landed deep. Familiar. Echoes of another voice. Years ago. Roy's eyes filled. I don't deserve this, he said hoarsely. Don't deserve you. Elena hesitated, then reached into her purse. Maria told me something else, she said softly. At the end. She pulled out a worn envelope, creased at the edges from being carried too long, too carefully. Roy stared at the envelope like it might burn him. On the front, in careful, elegant handwriting, were the words, When my son finds his way to you. Elena opened it slowly and began to read aloud. My dearest Roy, if Elena is reading this, then my prayers were answered. You found her. You found the music. I know what you became. I knew for years. Every violent choice, every dark path. And it broke my heart. But it never stopped me from loving you. I gave Elena more than a melody. I gave her a piece of your childhood, the pure part, before the world hardened you. I asked her to open a cafe, to play music, to wait. Because I knew. One day, you'd be tired. You'd need to come home. Son, you are not your worst act. You are not the sum of your sins. You are the boy who loved music, who defended smaller kids in school, who cried at Pinocchio. That boy is still inside you. Elena will help you find him again. Trust her. Trust the music. And Roy, forgive yourself. I already have. Your loving mother, Maria. By the time Elena finished, Roy was openly sobbing. Decades of restraint shattered. His face twisted, shoulders shaking as grief, shame, and relief tore through him all at once. He pressed a hand over his eyes like he could still hide from it, but the truth had finally reached him. Elena leaned over him and held him as he broke, her arms steady, both maternal and impossibly intimate. For the first time in his life, Roy didn't fight the comfort. The door burst open. Mr. Roy! Isabella sprinted into the room at full speed, climbing straight onto the bed despite the nurse's protest from the hallway. She carefully placed something on his chest. The music box. Fixed. Shiny. Whole again. I made it better, she said proudly. Agent Chen helped with the tiny screws. She wound the key. The melody filled the room, Maria's arrangement, soft and trembling with memory. The same tune that had once haunted an old man on a park bench now wrapped around 3 wounded hearts in a hospital room. Elena cried quietly. Roy laughed and cried at the same time. And for a moment that felt like forever, nothing else existed but the sound of forgiveness. March came in cold and gray. Roy walked into the courthouse in a borrowed suit that didn't quite fit his shoulders anymore. He had grown smaller since the shooting, thinner, quieter, like part of him had stayed behind on that cafe floor. In the gallery, Elena sat with Isabella tucked against her side. The girl's feet didn't reach the floor. She watched Roy like she was afraid he might disappear if she blinked. When Roy took the stand, the room leaned in. He said names. He said dates. He said places where men never came back. 20 years of violence spilled out in a steady, even voice. No drama. No excuses. Just truth laid bare. Across the courtroom, Uncle Sal stared at him with naked hatred. The old king watching his empire collapse from the mouth of the boy he had once owned. The verdict came like thunder. 15 family members convicted. RICO charges. Life sentences stacked like bricks. Witness protection was offered. Roy shook his head. I'm staying in Brooklyn. I've run enough. There was no family left to hunt him. Only memories. The headlines exploded anyway. Mafia enforcer's conscience. Roy refused every interview but one. The studio lights were soft. The questions were not. What changed you? The journalist asked. Roy didn't hesitate. A little girl gave me a cookie. Told me I looked lonely. She was right. A beat. Then, and her mother? Roy's mouth curved into a quiet smile. She gave me something harder to accept. Forgiveness. The final question came gently. Do you regret your past? His answer was steady. Every day. Every hour. But regret isn't redemption. Action is. Before the cameras cut, he added one last thing. I'm opening a music academy. For kids who grow up where I did. So they have another way out. The country leaned forward. And for the first time, it wasn't to watch a criminal fall. It was to watch a man build. June sunlight spilled through the broken windows of a former warehouse on 3rd Street, now bright with fresh paint, open doors, and the sound of tuning instruments. A hand-painted sign hung above the entrance. Cole Reed Academy. Maria's maiden name. Elena's surname. Inside, 20 children fidgeted in folding chairs, clutching violins too big for their arms, guitars still smelling of varnish, fingers hovering over piano keys with nervous excitement. Elena stood at the front as music director, guiding volunteers with quiet authority. Her violin lifted the room into silence as she played the first notes of the opening ceremony. Warm, steady, alive. Isabella darted between new students like a tiny tour guide. That's the practice room. Don't touch the drums yet. Mr. Roy fixes everything. And he did. Roy stayed in the background, toolbox in hand, patching loose boards, tightening chair legs, fixing crooked doors. No speeches. No spotlight. Just work. At first, the neighbors watched from across the street with folded arms and raised brows. Then the music began. Real music, clumsy and beautiful and loud with trying. Arms lowered. Doors opened. By the time Elena finished playing, some of the skeptics were quietly crying. A reporter shoved a microphone toward Roy. He hesitated, then spoke just once. I can't undo what I did, he said simply. But maybe I can stop one kid from making my mistakes. That was enough. The headline the next day read, From Enforcer to Educator. But Roy didn't read it. He was too busy fixing a squeaky piano bench. The Cole Reed Academy would go on to help hundreds of children. But that day, it helped one man finally become someone his mother could be proud of. Snow returned the way it always did, quiet, patient, erasing sharp edges. The same park bench waited beneath the same church steps. The same bells loomed above. But Roy was no longer alone. Elena sat beside him, coat pulled close. Isabella perched between them, legs swinging, boots dusted white. The music box rested on Elena's lap, fully repaired now. When she wound it, Maria's melody drifted into the cold like a blessing that refused to fade. They came here every year. Isabella tilted her head. Papa Roy, why do we come here? The name still surprised him, warmed him. He took a slow breath. Because this is where I stopped running, he said. Where I found you. Elena's fingers slid into his. Where we all found each other. Roy nodded, then reached into his coat pocket. The ring was simple, unpolished, honest. He held it out without a speech. Elena's eyes filled instantly. She laughed through tears. Isabella bounced in place before the answer was even spoken. Yes, Elena whispered. The kiss was gentle, no urgency, no fear, just years of pain finally melting into quiet certainty. As the church bells rang 9 p.m., Christmas officially began. They walked home together to the cafe, now their home above it, Isabella skipping ahead in wild zigzags through the snow. "We're a real family now," she shouted. And for the first time in 63 years, Roy Marchetti felt something settle inside his chest. Peace, at last. Redemption doesn't erase the darkness, but it can teach you to carry light anyway. Roy Marchetti spent 40 years destroying. He will spend the rest of his life building. Elena and Isabella gave him what he thought he'd lost forever, a reason to be better. And somewhere, Maria Marchetti smiled, knowing her music finally brought her son home. Through the cafe window, we see them now, decorating a Christmas tree together. The music box plays. What would you have done in Roy's place? Would you have taken the cookie? Would you have stayed and fought? Tell us where you're watching from in the comments. And if this story touched your heart, hit that subscribe button. Because every week, we bring you stories of love, loss, and second chances. Proof that it's never too late to change.